It hasn't started yet, right?
We are live now. All right. So hello and welcome back to CSC's live chat. I'm Sukanya Nair, and today we are going to discuss what's on the table at the fourth Financing for Development Conference, or FFD4, which is happening in Seville, in Spain. Joining us live from Seville are Avantika Goswami and Seher Raheja, who are part of CSC's climate team. They are tracking the discussions closely and bringing us sharp analysis from the ground. So welcome Avantika. Hi Seher. Thank you so much for being here. And I hope you guys are doing well.
Hi, Sukanya. Yes, there's a heat wave going on in Seville, but other than that, it's very interesting to be here.
Thank you so much once again for joining. So Avantika, before we tune in and for the benefit of everybody who may be hearing about FFD4 for the first time, can you explain what exactly is FFD4 and why is it important and why should we care about it?
Yeah, definitely happy to do that. So the financing for development process is an intergovernmental process convened by the United Nations, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, and the Economic and Social Council. So UNDESA and the UN ECOSOC. And it has been going on for a few decades now. And once in a decade, a conference takes place where different governments, academic, research, and civil society communities convene to discuss various challenges related to financing sustainable development and how the global financial system can actually support sustainable development. So this year, particularly, so FFD this year, the fourth conference is taking place after 10 years. The last installment was in 2015. Um, and an additional dimension to the usual discussions on development finance. An additional dimension under consideration this year is to reform global finance to bring forth the money needed for climate action, because climate is a growing priority crisis. So I think that's FFD's big broad mandate to address various challenges related to sustainable development and how to rewire the global financial architecture to really address them.
Okay, now that sort of sets in the context. Sayed, building on that, what are the major issues being discussed in civil, and what, according to you, are the major sticking points?
Thanks, Sukanya. So I just start off by saying that there were negotiations like happens in the UNFCCC climate process, kind of similar to that. This is also a UN-driven process. So there have been negotiations and discussions that have been happening throughout the year leading up to this conference in Seville. So the major issues that have been discussed up until now and are continuing to be discussed now in a refined way in Seville were wide-ranging. So everything to do with how we can finance sustainable development, including the SDGs. So, for instance, some of the key ones were global solidarity levies, which proposes to basically tax the super rich or highly polluting activities in order to channel that collected finance towards sustainable development. How to help debt burden countries with development and climate action, because majority of their money ends up going towards debt servicing instead of towards their social spending and climate security spending. There have been, to go a little step further on the debt question, there have also been conversations on solutions like swaps or debt pause clauses, and more importantly and broadly, the ask by developing countries for a sovereign debt workout mechanism that is UN-led. But this has been a little contentious, and we'll get to the details in a moment. But they've also been discussing global tax architecture reform, as well as innovations to boost the funding and capacity of international financial institutions, including primarily but not limited to multilateral development banks. So these are some of the issues that have been discussed leading up to Seville and continue to be discussed here. And just to give a sense of the process and what exactly the conversation that's happening right now, the document, which has already kind of been adopted by the leaders in New York, called the Compromiso de Seville, which is the outcome document, is essentially going to be a blueprint for development finance for the coming decade. But this is a political commitment rather than a legally binding one, as is the case with most UN-driven processes. So yesterday we had an opening plenary which spanned well over 3 hours, and there were high-level statements by the president of the ECOSOC, the World Bank President Ajay Banga, country statements by individual countries and groups like the G77, all of them kind of signaling where they stand with respect to the document and discussion so far. And there are also now, starting yesterday, going to be thematic roundtables on specific topics. So yesterday's was on improving domestic resource mobilization, and the following days are going to, see thematic roundtables by experts and countries on leveraging private business and finance, improving international development cooperation, upholding the multilateral trade system, realizing a development-oriented sovereign debt architecture, and of course, reforming the international financial architecture and systemic issues as well. And there are also going to be high level side events with different topics and priorities that are continuing throughout.
Okay, all right. So the next question is for the both of you. And so as you had already mentioned, one of the hottest topic right now is debt. So what has happened so far on that front, and what is the climate link? Who would like to start?
Yeah, I can start us off. So definitely the issue of debt, particularly sovereign external debt, has very much been in focus. So this is an issue that has been elevated over the past few years, and now even within the climate community and discourse, the centrality of the debt crisis is very much a part of the discussions. So essentially, many developing countries are facing a huge external government debt crisis. And in addition to that, we have an unfit global financial architecture, which makes accessing finance more difficult for countries in the developing world. And governments are left with the option of either servicing the debt or serving the people through various developmental expenditures. So we've actually done some analysis on this, which will be forthcoming, but we can share a few brief highlights. And there's also like a lot of great work on debt being produced by economic and financial justice groups out there. But just coming in very briefly on kind of the scale of the problem for developing countries, and here we are categorizing low and middle income countries, or LMICs. The total external debt stock has increased by 55%, from 5.71 trillion in 2013 to 8.84 trillion in 2023. And the number of LMICs whose external debt exceeded 50% of their GNI actually doubled within this decade. And in terms of just the increase in debt stock, African region, like Africa as a continent, has seen debt stock doubling in this period. The same for the Asia Pacific region has been 1.7 times higher in the past decade, and for Latin America and the Caribbean region has been 1.6 times higher. If we get down to thinking about actual debt servicing, which are the annual payments that countries are making in terms of debt repayment, interest, and other fees, which is known as external sovereign debt servicing payments. For low and middle income countries, for every $1 of GNI, or gross national income, that they have earned, they were paying 1.6 cents in external sovereign debt servicing in 2013. This has increased to 2.5 cents in 2023. And we are also correlated a bit with the debt servicing question. We've seen a huge rise in interest payments, particularly for the African region. It has had the highest rise in interest payments on sovereign debt. The interest payments have increased about 3.2 times, from 7.8 billion in 2013 to 25.1 billion in 2023. What all of this is doing actually is that it's resulting in a net negative transfer from developing to developed countries, because the developed countries are where most of the creditors or lenders are located. So in 2022 and 2023, developing countries cumulatively paid 38.5 billion US dollars more to their external creditors than they received in fresh loan disbursements. which has resulted in a negative net resource transfer. So this is kind of the scale of the debt crisis that civil society and developing countries have been highlighting here at FFD and in the months leading up to it. And I'll hand over to Seher to talk a bit about the climate dimension.
Thanks for laying that out, Avantika. So yeah, the analysis that we did try to understand, like what many others have also done, establish a link between, climate and spending for climate and the sovereign debt crisis as such. So the total external climate finance needs, for instance, of emerging markets and developing economies, excluding China, amount to about 1 trillion. If you look at that on an annual basis, we're looking at, they require about 1,000 billion in external finance annually in order to finance their climate action. So this is their climate needs. But we found that they are spending nearly the same amount each year just on servicing external debt. The total external debt service of LMIC countries, excluding China, in 2023 stood at 970 billion. So 970 billion, 1,000 billion, we're looking at almost the same amount of what is needed for climate action and effectively, implementing climate action is actually going towards external debt servicing alone. So that's the start of it. Then we looked at a set of about 36 countries, and over half of these low and middle income countries, which are highly vulnerable to climate change, over half of them are already in debt distress or at a high risk of it. And that's not a small number. So let's look at what has been flowing in for climate for these countries versus what they actually require. So of these countries, between 2012 and 2022, the climate-related development finance or development finance, including ODA and other official flows that has been coming in, that is climate tagged according to what are called the Rio markers. Basically money that has come in as development finance with a climate component or a climate objective. For these 36 countries between 2012 and 2022, it amounted to about 78 billion. So if we look at that on an annual basis, that's about 7.7 billion per year. Whereas we also pulled out the costed needs for implementing these same countries' nationally determined contributions or their national climate plans. The costed needs for these countries amounted in total to about 79 billion annually. So what they need to spend on climate is 79 billion per year, but what they've been getting in climate related development finance is about 7 billion per year. And that's a very big gap. And we need to therefore bring in the debt question along with the climate question, right? And we had a couple more points of analysis. So the external sovereign debt in 2022 stood at about 13.24 billion, which is 1.8 times more than the climate-related development finance that came in, again, for that set of 36 highly vulnerable countries that we're talking about. So if you were to look at some examples, debt service is higher than climate-related finance that's flowing in for countries like Chad, Guinea-Bissau, Haiti, Sierra Leone. And in Chad and Guinea-Bissau and Haiti, how much they spend on debt service is actually also more than what they're spending on either health or education. And that's some excellent analysis by UNCTAD that has been cited by pretty much everyone trying to talk about the debt crisis and in the context of development, and now increasingly for climate as well. So let's just zoom in on Chad for a second, right? 2.1 billion is what they require to implement their climate action successfully. Whereas so far, what has flown in the form of climate-related development finance is about 177 million. And add to this the dimension of damages or costed damages faced by these countries because of climate worsened events. So when we talk about climate, we're talking also mainly about extreme weather events and the damages and losses that come in from them. So Chad itself alone faced about 29 million damages, 29 million in damages, and also spent 393 million in external debt service alone. So more than 7 times what it spent on health as a share of GDP was actually spent on servicing debt. Essentially, the numbers keep pointing to more money going out just to keep repaying loans that were already on difficult terms to begin with. And therefore, these countries having to sacrifice spending on their people and increasingly also not be able to make the amount of spending that's required for climate resilience. And just the last point, and I'll pause there. We also looked at the share of non-concessional versus concessional flows in the climate-related development finance data set, right? And this is important because I guess at the core of the debt issue is the fact that developing countries are demanding high quality finance, whether that's climate finance in the UNFCCC discussions or finance for development here at FFD. What they want is good loan terms, more grants, more concessional finance, not just market rate debt that piles on their problems and exacerbates it more. So around 2015, we saw that the share of non-concessional flows in climate-related development finance overtook concessional flows, and that trend still continues all the way until 2022. So for any of the climate questions to be addressed, these debt questions will also have to be addressed, and I'll stop there for now.
All right. Thanks, Aher. So before we wrap up, do you guys have any final thoughts on what we should be watching as far as the discussion is progressing in Seville?
Should I just jump in on this one? Yeah. So some of the thoughts on, what are then countries looking for and what is the way forward? So I think specifically on the debt question, the main thing that developing countries have been demanding through the negotiations throughout the year has been a UN-led permanent sovereign debt workout mechanism. What this means is they want the United Nations, where most countries, all countries get equal say and an equal footing in having a discussion on what needs to be done, to be the space where debt resolution is brought in. As of now, when countries have really high debt burdens and need or reach the point of needing debt restructuring or are about to default, the spaces where they can go for recourse or resolution are the G20 Common Framework. This is a space that is creditor-led. It doesn't bring in private creditors to the table who also hold a lot of developing country debt, and it doesn't allow for an equal voice in actually voicing the concerns that these countries have. And so the resolutions are really protracted and often amount to very small amounts of actual help towards developing countries. So the biggest demand has been for a UN-led permanent space for an intergovernmental debt workout mechanism. However, we saw that in the final outcome document, the language on this demand was completely diluted. And this was literally because of blocking by global north countries, including the United States, which at the last moment exited the conversation altogether. So, sorry, you asked me for what we should look forward to in terms of solutions, and I gave you more cynicism, but that's where things stand. So while we're here, we're looking at the voices being amplified by civil society, the points that are being amplified by experts and progressive academics, and also the statements that developing countries are putting in saying, okay, we might not have the language that we wanted, but in the implementation and the operationalization of this outcome document, we need to make sure that the standard is higher and hopefully set the tone right for the decade to come.
Thank you, Seher. It was insightful, but also scary just to think about these. Yeah, Avantika, any last words?
No, I think Seher summed it up really well. Just wanted to say that we are going to be here for the rest of the week and following the proceedings and sharing updates. So yeah, please do follow CSE's social media channels and blogs for Down to Earth. And we'll try our best to kind of demystify all of the discussions over here.
All right. Once again, guys, thank you so much, both Avantika and Seher, for making time, and that too, coming live from Spain, because I'm sure you'll be running around for the next 1 week. So, and also thank you so much, guys, for joining us today. And if you have any queries, do drop it in the chat, and we'll see. Whenever they get a minute, I'm sure they'll be happy to answer those queries. And if you're interested, and as Avantika has already mentioned, we will be putting out all the updates, analysis through our social media channels, and you can also follow us from our CSE website. That's all for now, and thank you for watching once again. Bye bye. Take care.